Okay, very good. We'll try it out. Let's see. Hopefully it'll work well. Okay. Well, today I want to speak about the Noahide law regulating sexual relationships. And this is, of course, something which in the Western world is of tremendous importance and under great threat. Obviously not so in Indonesia, because Indonesia is a traditional society. So you may have other questions. You know, in other words, I'm sure everybody here, of course, is aligned with the Noahide laws, but there's a lot of explanation which is needed to people living in the West about these matters. And I think I will speak a little bit about that because it is important to have the general understanding. Well, now, the first thing is that, and maybe the first point to be made, and this is something which people in Indonesia understand very well, and that is that we do not say that there is a private domain which the law should not enter. There are people in the West who say, why does the government, why does legislation concern itself with the private morality of individuals? Well, the answer to this by the Noahide laws is a very straightforward one. That when a law is enacted, when a law permits something, when the society allows things to go on, or it even legislates permission for people to engage in all kinds of relationships, that affects the consciousness of the society. It affects the morality of the society. Just to give you an example, once again, this is not something which you'd find in Indonesia necessarily, but to go to another area, the area of abortion, for example. Once a society permits abortion on demand, then the consequence of that is that people begin to think that it's an intrinsically permissible thing. So this is one of the reasons why society must make laws about personal morality. There is no such thing. We know that there are laws in the Noahide laws. There are laws between the person and God, and between person and person. Between person and God are the laws relating to idolatry and blasphemy, and also sexual relations, which I'll explain in it shortly. And between person and person are the laws of theft and killing and justice. And the treatment of nature is a special category by itself. But the society must have laws which relate to matters of personal morality. You cannot simply put this aside and say this is none of the state's business. It's not true, because it becomes part of society's values when it is permitted. Now, how is the translation working? Is it coming along? Is it coming across clearly? Okay, very good. I'm amazed. Is this good? We have to thank Google for this. Is that right? Google Translate. I don't know. Oh, I see. Oh, I understand. Oh, very good. That's good. That's fine. Okay. Now, the sexual relationships are in the category of a law between the human being and God. Now, that may sound strange to people, because obviously these relationships very often involve other people. It looks as if it's between person and person. However, the reason why these laws are generally described as matters between the person and God is because they affect human identity, who we are as individuals. So there may be an exception to this, well, that is to say adultery, for example, is partly an interpersonal relation, because it destroys another person's marriage. It affects somebody else. But in the other relationships, you see, If they're not, it is irrelevant. For example, in areas such as homosexuality and incest, it is irrelevant whether people consent to it or do not consent, because it is something which it intrinsically affects the identity of a human being. Because in the West, people are saying, why do you have to interfere with this? After all, can't adults consent to what they want to do? There's no harm, there's no hurt, there's no damage. What business is it to make laws in this area? Well, the answer is, as I'll explain, as I've begun to explain, and I'll continue, is that these are matters of relating to what a human being is and the way in which a human being is made in the image of God. So let's look at the Bible and see what it says about the whole concept of the norm of sexual relations, which is to marry and to marry a person of the opposite sex and to have children. The Bible says, a man shall leave his father and mother and cleave to his wife, which means attach himself to his wife, join with his wife, and they shall become one flesh. Now, what is the meaning of this? What this obviously is, one of the commentators say, this is not just true of it's not just true of human beings. Animals also, you have two and they become one. You have a male and a female. They join together and they produce another. Well, that's the idea. So it's for the human beings. So why does the Torah, what's so special about the Torah's mentioning this in regard to the human being? Well, the idea here is that the heterosexual relationship is an essentially procreative relationship. It's a relationship which can produce children. Sometimes people can't. For various reasons, they can't have children. Well, that doesn't take away from the fact that this is an essential union, the union of male and female, because it is in principle that which can create another human being. Now, the idea here is, though, that when a man and a woman marry and they have a child, this creates a very important relationship between the generations and between the husband and wife themselves. The husband and the wife, by joining together, they have a continuation. Their continuation is their child. In other words, their shared future is their child. And conversely, when we look around from the other point of view, the child says, where do I come from? Who am I? I am the product of this father and this mother. And now we can actually understand the question which I raised earlier, which is raised by commentators. Why mention this only with regard to human beings? Don't animals also, a male and a female, produce offspring? Well, the difference is that with animals, they do produce offspring, but the offspring walk away from the parents, and the parents walk away from the offspring. The identity does not remain. Whereas with a human being, they even after the baby has been born and nurtured and raised, the identity continues for the entire lives of the children and the parents and beyond sometimes. So this is something which is there is a essential continuity. This is how the human being expresses him or herself in this ability to produce another child, a projection and a continuation of him and herself. Now, obviously, this cannot be in a homosexual relationship, and it certainly can't be in the relationship between a human being and an animal, which is also prohibited. So let me go, because as I mentioned before I go further, the 4 relationships which are prohibited are adultery, homosexuality, bestiality, which is a relationship with an animal, and incest with a close relative. So the only union, the only union which can legitimately produce an extension is a heterosexual one. Now there is incest, and incest could also produce offspring, but there are other reasons why incest is prohibited, and it's a very deep topic. But I won't go into it here. But it is something which is also included. But our main battles in the outside world are in the area of homosexual unions, because even when homosexuals will go and they will, by various means of reproductive technology, obtain children. For example, they'll use surrogates, or they'll use donor gametes, and so on and so forth. They're not projecting themselves. The child is not biologically related to the parent, and so something very deep there is missing. So that's all one. That's one point. And there's another point also, about which, because in other words, this is our ability to. First point is that our ability to have a child is something which is intrinsic to our identity. It is the continuation of ourselves, self and our throughout time. I come from somewhere and I'm going somewhere. And this is the chain of generations, and there is a transmission. And it's not just a biological transmission, it is also a spiritual continuity. Because the idea basically is, why is it that we have children? We have children in order not simply to reproduce the human species, but also because we want to produce another moral agent just like ourselves. It is important for us to be a good person and to produce another good person. And when the child is continuing the values of its parent, the parent lives on, so to speak, not just biologically, but also in terms of this spiritual mission. There is this continuous identity, both biologically and spiritually, between the generations. There's much more that can be said here, because also the union of male and female is something which this is also part of the imitation of God, because, and this is a very deep topic, God has both a transcendent and an immanent, which means God is beyond the world and transcends it, and also God is immanent within it as well. He is able to nurture the creation as well as being its transcendent creator. Two different powers of God. And these in many ways also correspond to the male and female dimensions. There are the male is a more remote, and the female is a more close. It's a closer and more binding relationship within and inside the family. We see, for example, the way in which a child is conceived. The father contributes a seed, but it is the mother who articulates within her womb the whole growth of the child. And these two functions parallel different aspects of the divine. God is a transcendent creator who gives the possibility of existence, and also God is as working within the creation to nurture and give vitality to all the things within it. In other words, what we see here is that this is the procreative relationship, which is governed by the laws, the Noahide law on sexuality, has to do with what a human being is, and the union into which a human being can merge. A human being becomes whole through joining with a person of the opposite sex and being able to have a child. Two people of the same sex cannot do that. A person and an animal cannot do that. And similarly, and there are other reasons why incest are forbidden. But this is, but all of these have to do with who the person is, and that as a reflection of the divine. It's quite a deep concept, but anyway, I just thought I would mention that. And that's why these relationships are called primarily between the human being and God, and it's irrelevant whether in a forbidden relationship the different parties consent or not. The consent makes no difference, because it's not about interpersonal harm or conflict. It's about who the person is standing before God, what the identity of the person is. All right, how are we going? Does anybody want to? Should I pause for a moment, or should keep going? What do you say?
Pak Leo. Ya, jadi tadi kan kalau yang memakai keturunan terus memakai seperti bayi tabung gitu kan tidak sesuai, karena dijelaskan Rabbi kan panjang lebar gitu. Nah, maksud saya sebenarnya boleh nggak sih mempunyai anak lewat bayi tabung kayak gitu? Makasih Pak Leo.
Well, now, do you mean using a donor sperm, for example, or a donor egg, or using a surrogate? Is that what you're saying? That's the question? Well, that is certainly permissible. There's no problem at all where there's in vitro fertilization using the mother and using the couple's donor gametes. That's it. There's nothing wrong at all. It's fine. It's perfectly good. That's perfectly acceptable. There is a question in my mind about the use of donor gametes. I don't. It may not be forbidden. It may be that it's not forbidden, but I see a major problem with the question of the well-being of the child. In other words, can we bring a child into the world which is never going to be raised by its own biological parent? This is a question. It is a problem. It is a problem. It's not optimal. It is something which worries me. And the same thing is with surrogacy, because there is a very big question as with surrogacy, as to who is the mother. Is the mother the woman who provided the egg, or is the mother the one who gave the womb? It is a very ambiguous issue. And once again, it affects identity. It affects the identity of the child. It is very important for us to know who our parents are. And apart from that, also, there are sometimes major concerns with with donor sperm and so on. We don't know sometimes whether of the relationship. We don't know, or donor eggs and things of that sort. Does this make in other words, is there a possibility that one could encounter at a later stage somebody who and marry? Unmute. Yeah, unmute. Okay. There's sometimes also a worry that we don't, when there's no registry of where the sperm is coming from, that relative children, brothers and sisters could marry one another. It happens. And it's not such a far-fetched concept, because very often you find that people who are using donor material, they come together in support groups, and they have friendship amongst them, and their children can also sometimes, it's been known to happen, could marry each other. In other words, we have to know where we come from. There has to be something like this. So in vitro, in other words, where the mother and the father give their own material, that's no problem at all. That's good. That's fine. But there may, and it may be also to use a donor, maybe, but it worries me. It worries me a little bit, because as I say, I don't know that that's necessarily the best thing for a child, to be born not to be raised by its own biological parent. That's a matter of concern. Yes. Okay.
Jadi mau tanya, Moralitas.
About what? Could you repeat the question, please? Sorry. With the surrogate? Yeah, well, so that's the answer is no. It's not. It's certainly not permitted, because first of all, the Torah prohibits a homosexual practice, and secondly, the context for having children is between a mother and between a man and a woman. So there's no permission for such a thing in Torah law like that for homosexuals or lesbians to have children of their own. They are first of all, because it's a very bad example to the child. This is a child needs a mother and a father, and the child should be raised by a mother and a father. Now, and in a heterosexual relationship. Now, I'm not minimizing the difficulties and the problems and psychological issues which homosexuals may have, and but this is something which it remains something which is prohibited by the Torah, and therefore all we can do is to try to help these people if they are conscious of the fact that there is a God who made this commandment, and that to help these people to a normal heterosexual relationship. But there's no, we cannot legitimate a relationship which the Torah prohibits. So I don't know if I've answered the question there properly or not. Okay, fine, very good. But I would like to say one other thing is, in my opinion, it would be more appropriate rather if a couple could not have children by themselves. I'm talking about a man and a woman. Then, in some ways, it would be better, in my view, for them to adopt a child rather than create a new child with donor sperm or donor eggs. The reason for this is that if a child has already been, if there is a child waiting for adoption, well, this is a sad thing for that little child. Now it becomes a very good deed, right, to take in an orphan, to adopt a child who is not wanted by its parents. And it's like it's adopting a little orphan in some ways. Maybe it's not an orphan because its parents died necessarily, but it's an orphan because it's been cast out or rejected by its parents. But to create, but when we use the donor sperm and donor egg to create a child in the first instance who will not be raised by his own parents, that's wrong. In other words, it's take this after the fact that we have an orphan. That's great. Take in an orphan, adopt. But to create an orphan is not a good thing, in my view. To create a child who is not going to be raised by its mother and father. This, in my view, is a very problematic thing, which creates harm, so to speak, for the identity of the child. Why should a child be created not to be raised by its parent, not in the first place? But if it happened that there is such a child, then adopt the child. You know, if they cannot have their own children, for example. That's the only point I would make there. Yes. What? So who says okay? Because unfortunately they don't keep the Torah. It's a very sad thing. There are Jews, Reform and Conservative, don't acknowledge the sanctity of the Torah. They believe that they can change it, whereas the Orthodox Judaism from Sinai says there is a God and He made the rules. God made the rules. There are laws, and the very fact that if unfortunately there are movements which move away from the divinity of the Torah and the sacredness of the Torah, then that's a very sad thing. But that's it. This is unfortunately is the story of much of the history of the Jewish people, that there were sects which broke away from the Torah tradition. And so I don't reject these people as Jews. They still may be Jews, and of course we have to love a fellow Jew. But unfortunately, they have been led astray. They are in error, unfortunately. So that's the answer to that. Okay. All right. Good. Now, all right. Now, what about, of course, marriage? Now, it's interesting. We were talking about marriage before, but marriage is, of course, the correct context for having sexual relations and for raising children. Now, the question is, what makes marriage? What is marriage? So when we look at certain certain views, it says some views say it's enough that a man and a woman designate one another as their partners and live together as man and wife. But there's also that constitutes marriage. Now, however, in my view, marriage needs more than that. I mean, when I say this is there are views which say that marriage should also include a concept of it should include a formal legal structure. In other words, and it could be even that the first view takes this view also, that it has to be publicly known that these people are married. It's not simply a casual relationship. Then there are views also that marriage has to involve financial commitments. Not only has to be a legal statement, but it should also have there are views to this effect. I think they're good, they're right. It's desirable to follow these views, that the marriage contract should also include financial obligations. So this too, I think if I'm not mistaken, there are those who have written what's called a ketubah. It's the equivalent. It's not quite the same as the Jewish ketubah, which is the marriage document, but the document needs to have legal and financial obligations built into it. So, and of course, I mean, I'm sure that the people I'm speaking to here would appreciate this, but also it's a very desirable thing also that the marriage should have some sort of sanctification. Now, basically, this may not be required in Noahide law, but it's certainly something which acts to give the marriage more stability and fixity. It needs to be a solid commitment. Okay, so probably I don't know that I'm telling anybody probably everybody here feels this way, but this is in the West we have what's called a very significant de facto relationships, which means that they live together, but they're not married. Is this marriage in Noahide law or not? And there's an argument about that, but it's certainly not the ideal marriage. For a Jew, it's not allowed, it's not permissible at all. A Jew is obligated to sanctify a marriage in a specific manner, and to consecrate his wife to him, and that's marriage. But in Noahide law, there was a view that maybe it's enough if one has designated that person as one's permanent spouse. But as I've mentioned before, it seems to me that the right way to go here is to make it into a formal contractual relationship, legal and financial obligations. So that is what constitutes marriage. So so that really would exclude. See, the problem is with these de facto relationships, which we have so much in the West. They are not really committed relationships. And even though the law may come along and say, and may treat them as committed relations. For example, if a couple has been living together and they decide to split up, so the secular law may require them then to split their assets as though they were married. But still, in my view, that doesn't give it the strength of marriage, because they didn't make the mental, legal, formal commitment to one another. So this concept of a formal commitment is very important to marriage. Okay, so any questions on that? Because I'll go to some other topics now. Now, what about the issue of
Saya mau nanya, mau reko, boleh nggak?
what about the issue of procreation? Yes, sure. Yes, please.
Saya mau nanya, gimana orang yang mungkin dalam pernikahan atau mungkin tidak dalam pernikahan berganti-ganti pasangan untuk hubungan seks, maksudnya itu jiwa mereka dalam hukum Torah sakit nggak atau rusak nggak?
So it's an important question. Now, when if we look at the Bible, we see that there is there was the generation of the flood. Now we know that the generation of the flood was a generation which was very promiscuous. In other words, it was very casual in its relationships, and there is an indication that it's brought down in various sources that after that, the nations took upon themselves extra stringencies. And one of those stringencies was not to have casual relationships. Some say whether it's involved with people who are unmarried. Now, then also in addition to that, there is a notion that promiscuity is something also which can lead to a loss of identity, because unfortunately promiscuity very often results in children being born, and these children, for example, may not know where they come from, or may not always know where they come from and what their background is, and they may marry people whom they're not allowed to marry. Once again, a problem of incest. But I think that it is something which is very important nowadays, that one try to introduce the concept that sexual relations should take place only within the context of marriage. Is it forbidden if they're not married to do that? I don't know if it's actually forbidden, but it's certainly not desirable. In Jewish law, it is forbidden. It is actually forbidden to engage in sexual relationships outside of marriage. Because the sexual relationships need to take place in a context of commitment and a degree of sanctity. Now, I think that Noahide law moved to some extent towards this idea also, even though the society we're living in now in the West is the very opposite, unfortunately. But it is something which is it is certainly desirable to require that sexual relationships occur within marriage for a whole host of reasons. It's not just because of promiscuity, but then it leads to abortion. It leads to children born out of marriage. It leads to a whole host of situations which are very undesirable, and it removes basically the sanctity of the whole sexual relationship, which expresses a bond between two committed people, husband and wife. So I would say that something which the society needs to educate against. There should not be sexuality outside of marriage. Well, I don't like to say when I say damage, everybody, we are all capable of teshuva. You know, teshuva means we all can all change ourselves. Nobody is lost. Nobody's lost. We always can improve. I like to look at it this way rather than say, you know, but it's something that is not something which one should. If it happened in the past, that's past. One needs to change for the future. But it's not something which we should endorse in the first instance. It should, in the first instance, it is not something to endorse. It needs human sexuality is something which needs to be it is something which is a glue for a loving relationship, for a sanctified relationship, and it needs that, and that's the proper place for it. And otherwise, it becomes it can be damaging. It can be not so much. It can be damaging for the people in as much as they don't form a committed relationship. You know, forgive me, I don't mean to be vulgar, but people say there's an expression in English which says, if you've got the milk, who needs the cow? You know, in other words, it's not a very nice expression. People have all the benefits of marriage without any responsibilities. And so in some ways, it actually strengthens non-responsibility. So I think our society is one which definitely needs to move towards this concept. In the West, it's everywhere. People might laugh at me if I were to say this, but I will say it anyway. I don't think people are happier because they have sexual relationships without commitment. I think in many ways what you find, unfortunately, is that it trains people in irresponsibility rather than the other way around. So human sexuality is a very important thing. It has to do with the capacity of a human. It expresses the bond between a husband and a wife, and also the ability to create new generations. Now, obviously, not everybody can. Older people can't have children anymore, but that doesn't take away from this basic notion that they are together a whole unit, which is actually expressed in their biological complementarity. They form a whole, they form a unit, and it's expressed through this. So I think that there is a very important spiritual significance in the notion that sexuality takes place within the context of marriage. That's all. Okay. So now let's go to some other areas. Now, is there an obligation to have children? So this is a very interesting issue. In other words, what happens? What happens if a people say, I will live a moral life, but I just don't want to have children. I don't want to get married. Is this an acceptable view? Here again, there are a couple of views in Noahide law, several. It seems that the basic require is that a person who, for example, if a woman, or for example, doesn't want to get married at all, she has not transgressed, because she's not obligated. And same thing would be with a man. Obviously, a man has to know that he'll be able to behave himself too if he doesn't get married and live a life of a moral life without getting married. There's no obligation to get married or to have children. However, there is a collective obligation to see that there is a new generation. In Jewish law, as individuals, they're not obligated, but the society as a whole should produce a new generation. In other words, there's it's a general, not an individual obligation. In Judaism, it is an individual obligation on a man to have children. A Jewish woman who doesn't get married has not done anything wrong. But a Jewish man must make every effort to get married and have children. That's the way it is. But there are some now. So what about Noahide law? So in Noahide law, neither a man nor a woman individually is obligated to have children. But it is certainly a desirable thing. Right? It is certainly a desirable thing, and as a whole, the society should try to have children, and we should also try as individuals to have children. You know, it says our goal should be to be a good person and to produce another good person. That's in other words, we are agents. Who are we? Why are we here? We're here to do good in the world, right? To make the world a better place. So I shouldn't limit that to myself. I should produce another one and try to educate my children also to be good human beings in the world. So that's the bottom line. It is clearly desirable, but it is not a transgression in Noahide law if one has not had children, not to marry. That's not a transgression. Obviously, but you understand. I mean, sexuality should be in the context of marriage. But if for some reason a person chooses not to get married and can live a moral life, they have not transgressed. Okay, but still, as I say, the best thing is to have children. There's no question about it. All right. Now, so there are other areas here. What about things like prostitution and so on? Certainly, prostitution is something that's seen as something which is undesirable. It is clearly undesirable. Apart from the fact that we said before, children can be produced as a result of promiscuity, and prostitution is professional promiscuity that creates confusion amongst offspring. But even so, it is a terrible cheapening. It's clearly an undesirable thing. There's no question that the Noahide law looks down upon prostitution, and similarly things like masturbation are also something which is also prohibited. So there are border areas of relating to humans to human sexuality. Now, I'm just trying to think what else could I speak about? What about there's also an interesting case here. What about castration? So there is a whole question. For example, does Noahide law permit the castration of animals? There's an argument about that. The basic law is the basic conclusion is that castration of animals is not forbidden. In Jewish law, it is forbidden, but it is permissible in Noahide law. Now, how does that affect? What about with regard to a person? It could be also that a person wanted to sterilize themselves. It could be that that's not prohibited. But obviously it's not optimal for a human being. It's far from optimal from a human being. Well, things like, but it is a practical issue because people have what's called mastectomies. They have various kinds of operations which make them infertile, which sterilize themselves. That may not be prohibited. No, well, that may be acceptable. But at all events. That's something which is, there's a link there also between the idea of is there an obligation to reproduce individual, just as there is no personal or individual obligation to have children. Therefore, it may be also that castration is also, we're talking obviously voluntary castration, voluntary sterilization and so on and so forth, that may also be permitted. But anyway, not ideal. So are there any questions now? Leo.
Pak,
Yes.
Pak mau tanya. Pak, gimana dengan kasus itu, Pak? Ini kan sudah sempat kejadian yang misal transgender cewek malah dia ketemu transgender cowok dan jadinya nikah gitu. Ya secara kan sebenarnya tetap cowok sama cewek kan, tapi kan kondisinya sudah kayak gitu. Itu kalau menurut Torah gimana itu, Pak?
Okay. It's a very important question, and unfortunately, a very real question, because we know what's happening in the world with this regard too. Now, the Torah says that a human being is the identity of the human being comes from their actual biological gender. A male has got certain biological features. A female has got other biological features, and there is a very rare phenomenon called a hermaphrodite, where very occasionally a person is born with both. Now this, and the Torah provides rules and laws for each of these categories. However, let's not worry about the hermaphrodite at this point, because it's a very rare case, and it's a special topic. I won't go into that now. But the Torah says that if you are born as a male, that is what you are, and if as a biological male, if you're born if you are born as a biological woman, that is what you are. And this concept of and if a person acts to alter that, to take surgery to change it, then unfortunately the person stays what they were born, but they're unfortunately now just a mutilated version of it. And this is something which is clear in the Torah. It's a very, you see, that one of the unfortunate things is that when homosexual marriage came in, it undid it removed the concept of a moral definition of human relationships. And what flowed on from that was that we even lost the definition of what a male and a female is. In other words, we have all of the identities, all of the identities of different things in the world are given by the Torah itself. The Torah tells us what something is and what its law is. And so, and very often it's because there is a command. That's why we know what things are, because the Torah has also specified what things are. So the reality is, unfortunately, what I'm saying is politically very incorrect. But unfortunately, transgenderism is a mental illness. And it needs, and it could be something which came about as a result of trauma. For example, a girl who was molested, unfortunately, may come to hate her body, and she may now say she wants to be a boy. There may be other reasons. There may be a whole host of factors why it happens. But the fact that a person feels this way does not give that person any permission to alter their bodies or to act as though they were a member of the opposite sex. And this is a terrible confusion which has been generated by the rejection of sexual morality altogether. We now not only know people don't know what the values are. Now they don't even know the identities of things anymore. So once again, the Torah would view people like this with compassion and want to help. But the reality is that if a person was born with male features, then what God wants of that person is to live as a man. And if a person was born with female features, God wants that person to live as a female. And their ultimate actualization will be when if they will work through it, and they marry and have children as a man and as a male and a female. But it's the Torah which is the template of normality. Torah tells us what's normal, not the impulses and the perceptions of people. And it's unfortunately the society has developed into a situation now where people no longer think that conscience is the deciding factor, but mere impulse is the deciding factor. If a person has an impulse to steal, is he allowed to steal? Not allowed to steal. If a person has an impulse to gamble, does that make it permissible to gamble? No, because there is a conscience, there is a higher conscience which says, I have a problem, I have a difficulty. This person has impulses, I have perceptions, I have trauma, I have anxiety, I have this and I have everything else, and I should get help. But the ultimate decider of who I am and what I have to do, it doesn't come from my heart and it doesn't come from my psyche. It comes from my conscience. And conscience, that's what a human being is. To be human is to have conflict. To be human means to struggle with one's impulses and to struggle with one's perceptions and to ultimately to harmonize them with one's conscience. And that conscience is something which is guided by God and informed by God. And so in general, this is, and the transgenderism is a case where mere impulse, mere perception becomes dominant, and conscience, it becomes suppressed. So the answer is that it is a confusion, but the Torah is absolutely clear about this, that the male under all circumstances, whatever he or she does, whatever he does to his body, or the girl is a male, and they can harm their psyches. And we see, as a matter of fact, that there is the people who go through these transitioning have a very bad morbidity rate. In other words, it's very high suicide. It doesn't improve their well-being at all. So that's it. That's the clear picture. The Torah tells us what things are and what we have, both. We better finish soon, Leo. You may have to finish shortly, Leo. That's all. I have another commitment coming up. Good. Okay, you know what? If there's another question, I'll go another few minutes. But I just have to give another class soon. That's all. Good. Okay. All right. Okay, thank you. I hope I didn't upset people. But this is
Thank
really
you, Rabbi.
all right.
Bye.
Bye.
Baruch Hashem.
Morning.
Buat.
Assalamualaikum.
Toda Mureli.
Sudah more.
Sudah mau.
Toda Mureli.